We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. New documents revealed that Russia and Ukraine were close to a deal that would have ended the war back in April 2022. At the last minute, those negotiations were torpedoed. Today, we're talking about why the U.S. and NATO want endless war in Ukraine. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today, we're talking once again with Eugene Puryear. Eugene is an author, a political organizer, and activist. He is also the co-host of the Freedom Side Live, which you can watch every Thursday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern at Breakthrough News. Eugene, welcome back.
And thank you so much for having me.
Eugene, we had many discussions about the Ukraine war back in, before 2022, before the invasion in 2022, during the early days of the invasion, in the weeks and in the months after the invasion. We had many shows about it. We were assessing the war every day. While we were doing that, and something we perhaps did not yet know about, was that Russia, the Russian government, and the Ukrainian government were negotiating very intense, complicated, complex negotiations, and they were almost ready to sign a deal that would have ended this horrible war. Here we are 2 years later. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead or wounded. The U.S. is pumping billions of dollars of weapons into Ukraine. And we only learn now that there was almost a peace deal. Big question, what happened to the peace deal? Who torpedoed it? And what were the sticking points? Anyway, let's get your take. This was all revealed, by the way, recently in the New York Times.
No, I think it's a good point. And, just to reinforce the point you just made, I mean, the New York Times, article saying that we're further away from peace than we've ever been, which is, somewhat amazing in the context of revealing how close they were. But, I think there's a number of points on this. And I think that what is important is these documents reveal, when you look at the sort of issue of sticking points throughout the process, but especially towards the end of how the conflict could potentially be ended, that it really actually undermines a huge amount of the discourse that we have in the quote unquote West, in the United States and Europe and Canada, as it regards, what are things that should never be considered relevant. And I think to me, the most important one is the overall issue of the eastern parts of Ukraine that are now a part of Russia in some of the former oblast of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, other places like that. Because in the context of what we have heard consistently, including from the Ukrainian government, but certainly from the United States, certainly from the European countries, is Ukraine must win. And winning being defined as Russian troops must, be removed from all this territory, and it must be sort of sovereign for Ukraine. But what we learned from the documents from 2022 is that Ukraine was actually willing to cede that territory to Russia. And I think it's also worth noting here, Brian, parenthetically, that in 2019, Zelensky also agreed, by the way, to have a plebiscite in that part of what was then, sort of separated from Ukraine, kind of its own two countries, the People's Republics, as they called themselves, of Donetsk and Luhansk. But, I think most people thought at that time, and in the couple years prior to that when this was discussed, that, of course, that referendum would lead almost certainly to separation from Ukraine, either as independent countries or as part of Russia, or independent countries leading to part of Russia. And part of the reason why I think that's really important on the land issue is that it's not specifically just the issue of, well, Russia was in there and they were occupying it, as the way that it's been discussed. But when you chain it together with one of the other major sticking points that was there at the end, which is the issue of language and the changing of the language laws of Ukraine that were changed in 2014, it really helps us focus in on what this conflict is ultimately. I mean, it's about many things, but at the root of it, one of the biggest misunderstandings, the idea that this is a national liberation struggle of Ukrainians versus Russians. I would say this is something more akin to sort of a civil war between Ukrainians that concerns Russia, that Russia has intervened in. But in these republics, starting starting post-2014, the first law passed by this, post-2014, post-Maidan government was to make Ukrainian the only official language. And this is after a long issue that has existed in Russia in Ukraine, for some time. Starting in 2012, they were recognizing Russian as a language. 46% or roughly of Ukrainians are native Russian speakers. One of those people, by the way, is Vladimir Zelensky. But that's a whole other story. But that being said, you have this law that's passed around language. You have the burning of the Odessa Trade Union House where a number of people are killed. You have the imposition of a political narrative that to many people, especially in eastern Ukraine, is deeply offensive and tied with Nazism. And these areas in the eastern part of Ukraine then break off to defend themselves from a political vision that had been contested in Ukraine since the fall of the Soviet Union. But now the resolution was being imposed from above by force of arms. They set up these, sort of autonomous republics, and now they've ended up as a part of Russia and so on and so forth. But I say all that just to say that it's interesting to note that Ukraine was willing to cede this, just as they were in 2019, in 2022 as well, not just because there was a Russian occupation, but because they recognized that the people who lived in this area did not want to live under a Ukrainian government where this very specific vision of what it meant to be Ukrainian, what the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians was, what the historical memory in the battle against Nazism during the Soviet Union was, and what are the different rights and freedoms that different people wanted to have based on those different conceptions. The professor in the UK, Richard Sakwa, has called it two visions, a monist vision and a pluralist vision of Ukraine. And the monist vision, single sort of, what we know now as Ukrainian politics being imposed on a whole huge subset of the country, one of the most, I think the most populous region of the country, was never really going to work. So much of what we're told that this war can only end when Russian troops leave because it's a Russian invasion and all Ukrainians hate it is 100% false, as we can see. And if we're talking about what the path to peace is, we have to be more serious about that. So I think that these documents help us reset the understanding of what the conflict is really about in many ways, at least amongst Ukrainians themselves, the political forces on either side of the equation, the role of Russia in that, and how this conflict could easily be resolved by just recognizing these basic realities about the differences inside of Ukraine itself about a number of these crucial questions.
Yeah, Eugene, I think that many people in the United States, certainly in the United States, won't really understand the dynamics inside of Ukraine. They're complex, and there are many of them. One is, as you said, Ukraine isn't just one people. It's not just one ethnicity. There's a Russian population, a Russian-speaking population. There's a Ukrainian population. In the West, there are people who came from Romania or from Poland. This is a consequence of earlier European wars, and also a consequence of the fact that there were multinational or multi-ethnic empires in Europe. I mean, you had the Russian Empire, which included Ukraine and Belarus and Poland. You had the Austrian Empire, and then later the Austrian-Hungarian Empire that included big parts of other people and ethnicities in Europe. There was, the Ottoman Empire, of course. The British Empire was a little bit different because it was the island, and the British were basically focused on colonizing the rest of the world. Although they did have a big role in what happened in dynastic conflict in Europe. But people don't really, in the United States, won't get the fact that what happened in 2014, the coup d'etat that the U.S. sponsored, that Victoria Nuland and John McCain and all of the representatives of U.S. imperialism sponsored, that broke up an equilibrium, or what you called a pluralistic Ukraine, where the Russian-speaking population didn't feel that they had become not just second-class citizens, but actually targets of sort of a supreme extreme nationalism or fascism. I have a clip from Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who I would say, played a big and somewhat miserable role in the transformation of Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union, with shock economics and all of that. But he's a realist about politics, and he talked about what's prompting the current war between Russia and Ukraine. And he goes back to the 2014 coup d'etat that the U.S. sponsored. I want to play this clip from him, and then I want to show people a little bit of some of the video from the uprising that took place around the Maidan, the center of Kiev, the center of the capital of Ukraine, and how that was misrepresented in the Western media as some sort of freedom-loving enterprise. Anyway, let's first listen to Jeffrey Sachs, and I want to get your comments.
And then what it did in Kiev in February 2014. I happened to see some of that with my own eyes. The U.S. overthrew Yanukovych together with right-wing Ukrainian military forces. We overthrew a president. And what's interesting, by the way, is we overthrew Yanukovych the day after the European Union representatives had reached an agreement with Yanukovych to have early elections, a government of national unity, and a stand down of both sides. That was agreed. The next thing that happens is the opposition, quote unquote, says we don't agree. They stormed the government buildings and they deposed Yanukovych. And within hours, the United States says, yes, we support the new government. It didn't say, oh, we had an agreement. That's unconstitutional what you did. So we overthrew a government, contrary to a promise that the European Union had made. And by the way, Russia, the United States, and the EU were parties to that agreement. And the United States, an hour afterwards, backed the coup.
Eugene, he's not wrong there. That's almost exactly what happened. On February 21st, 2014, there was an agreement. The Yanukovych government sat down with the opposition. The United States, Russia, and several EU countries were present in the room as observers, as international observers. And Yanukovych signed an agreement. He's the president of Ukraine. He's the one who says, look, we want to be with Europe. We want to be in the EU, but we're not going to be in NATO. That's why he was basically targeted by NATO countries. So he agrees to early elections, decentralized power, meaning basically going along with the demands of the opposition. And the very next day, as Jeffrey Sachs points out, a fascist-led coup storms the parliament and the president flees for his life. And then you have Victoria Nuland and John McCain saying, great day for Ukrainian democracy. I mean, he's not wrong about the actual sequence of events there.
No, he's definitely not wrong about the sequence of events. And I think one thing that we have to add here is, through both research that has been done, very diligent research, but also now from the Ukrainian court system itself, it is very clear that the famous sniper incident at Maidan Square, which really enraged a lot of the people who were there to back some of these more, militant poses that were being pushed forward by the far right in terms of deposing Yanukovych and something like a coup, that was in fact a false flag by far-right forces who themselves were the snipers, who deliberately posed in such a way that it would create the perception that the government police officers or some sort of government forces were the snipers in order to help direct the crowd's anger, which was, at that time still not necessarily going to go in the direction that these sort of far-right pro-Western forces would want them to go. Because there's a lot of issues that are caught up in this, most notably the, deep corruption of Yanukovych, which is, of course, not unique to other Ukrainian officials, but has been a big undercurrent of protests going back to the color revolution days of the 2000s. And this is part of what the U.S. has been manipulating. But to drive at that final level, they create this false flag sniper attack to enrage people at the highest level, to bring it to a fever pitch in order to carry out this coup d'etat type scenario. So I think that, Mr. Sachs is 100% correct in terms of the scenario. And we can remember the handing out of cookies and McCain traveling there and all these other pieces that were designed to put this to the forefront. And again, this also goes back to the color revolution days when you had, in the mid-2000s, the issue of people protesting corruption. And as we know from WikiLeaks, U.S. government officials flying there immediately and meeting with people and saying, meeting with the opposition political parties, we'll back you, we'll support you, so on and so forth, in order to put their thumb on the scale. So we can really see that the role of the United States in particular in determining the direction of where Ukraine was going to go, let's say from 2014 on, has been quite significant. And of course is related to their own geopolitical geopolitical desires as it concerns the issue of Ukraine, which is, of course, in the most specific sense, to encircle Russia, as it were. But what's the sort of deeper question that's existing here? And, I talked about this at length in an article people can find at liberationnews.org called, Is NATO Really to Blame? That actually before the Soviet Union was dissolved, so from like 1989, into the early 1991, 1992 period, the huge concern that the U.S. ruling class had at that time was, and as it was stated once by one of the top officials in the George H.W. Bush administration, when he was making a note to one of his aides, he says, how do we get in between Germany and Russia? And the point being is that in the context of the collapse of and dissolution of the Soviet Union, which of course America wanted, the biggest fear they had was that the natural economic ties between Western Europe, especially countries like Germany, Central Europe, and Russia would create a new sort of European-Russian bloc that could actually challenge the United States of America and its sole hegemony after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And of course, their entire political strategy, as laid out in a number of national defense strategy, defense policy documents, was to control the entire world. And in some of these early documents, they say the only role for Russia is if Russia is essentially demilitarized, so that Russia in and of itself could not challenge U.S. hegemony, and that the natural economic, cultural, political ties, whatever you want to call them, between especially Germany and Russia, but really Western Europe and Russia, and even some parts of Central and Southeastern Europe, would, of course, create a new kind of hegemonic force on the world stage that could also challenge the United States. So the key factor of that strategy was to make sure that they did, in fact, get in between Germany and Russia, and they were able to create an alliance with these extraordinarily reactionary post-Soviet governments in Central Europe that, for their own reasons, many of which date back to the history that's related to World War II and prior to World War II that you mentioned of state building and empire building in this region, that they were willing to ally with the United States because they hated Russia to try to create a ever eastward moving presence of NATO as a check against Russia, even knowing that it could lead right up to the possibility of war, and of course has led to war. And that's what's behind the meddling of the United States in Ukraine. It's this long-term strategy that goes back to 1989 to make sure that the sort of Russian border to German border area of Central Europe is a zone of total U.S. control and influence, to prevent there from being any sort of force that can naturally emerge from that natural economic, social, political, historical space of Europe that could actually challenge the United States. No matter what the consequences for Ukrainians, no matter what the consequences for anyone else, that's the nature of their policy. And that's why they pushed this so aggressively in 2014, because they figured this is our time. Up to that point, there was significant disagreement in Ukraine. Should we join the EU? Should we join NATO? Some people saying yes, some people saying no. But this was the moment where they were able to seize on mass popular anger in some areas against Yanukovych for his own issues, the role of the far right in the streets that became significant and dominant, and the possibility of using public opinion worldwide around this idea of freedom and democracy to seize the time in order to complete the encirclement of Russia and the creation of this buffer zone, basically, in Central Europe to make sure U.S. interests remain whole.
Yeah. We have video, Eugene, that shows how violent the fascist wing of the Maidan protests were. And again, as you said, not everybody in Maidan was a fascist. That would be a stereotype, a caricature. Many were there because, one, they were protesting against Yanukovych's corruption. Two, they don't identify with an eastward-oriented Ukraine, meaning oriented towards Russia, because they are, and their people and ethnically are more oriented towards Europe. I mean, Ukraine is a very multi-ethnic society. But the fascist element was very present, very present. As a matter of fact, we and I showed you a clip at one time where some of the fascists got together and said, yeah, of course we were just 10%, but we were the decisive 10% of Maidan. And what made them decisive was their use of violence. You mentioned the sniper attacks. They were killing, now we know, they were killing people on their own side, in their own protests. I mean, by the way, they're virulently anti-gay, so some of the protesters were gay. They might have shot them. Who knows? But they don't care about that. They wanted to create an incident that would allow them to have a pretext to overthrow the government. They have their own agenda. Their agenda is to basically have a Ukrainian supremacist state against Russians and against other non-Ukrainian peoples who live in Ukraine. The U.S. has a different agenda, which is to make Ukraine basically a vassal of the United States, vassal of NATO, or actually in NATO, so that it could be a staging ground for, or the placement of U.S. weapon systems targeting Russia right on Russia's border. I want to come back when we think about this complexity, that there's different agendas. The U.S. agenda is one thing. They don't actually care about the conflict between ethnicities within Ukraine except to manipulate them. But the fascists actually do care because they hate Russians. They're Ukrainian supremacists. They are fascists. And then that goes back to where Zelensky, when Zelensky was actually agreeing in April 2022 in those negotiations to make Ukraine a permanent neutral state. Like they were making those kind of, gestures. I want to get to this because I want to figure out who torpedoed it. Was it the fascists who torpedoed those negotiations? Was it the U.S.? Was it the U.S., working with the fascists? Because Zelensky seemed to be ready to make a deal. But just to show the audience how violent the fascists were, I want to play this short. There's two clips. I want to run them consecutively. This is from Maidan. If this happened, Eugene, in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, the U.S. government, the Pentagon, and all the intelligence services would come out and mow people down because these people were not only killing other demonstrators, they were killing police. Let's watch this. There you see them blowing up a tank or a police vehicle. Another police vehicle in flames. I mean, Eugene, the U.S. would never, ever tolerate this. This was their allies in Maidan.
Yeah, I mean, we know for a fact they wouldn't tolerate it. All we have to do is look at the response of Donald Trump to the uprising against racism, and not just Donald Trump, all the politicians at the time who were denouncing the protesters, who were rising up during the Ferguson uprising, during Baltimore. I mean, obviously the far right, the Trumps of the world, people like that are just like crush them, kill them all. But even the Democrats who want to say that they do something about racism are like, oh, but you should never burn anything down. I think it was Obama who said you never got anything by burning anything down. So, ultimately it shows the hypocrisy, on so many different levels of these individuals. And I think it speaks to, you look at those sort of role of the far right and the point you already made about the decisive 10%. I mean, this is why the United States has prettified the Azov Battalion, the right sector, these other, Nazi and Nazi adjacent groups in terms of their own political ideology, because these are really the shock troops for a pro-Western agenda in Ukraine. Without them, they could not actually push forward their agenda. And I think that's been abundantly clear. I mean, you already raised it in the lead up to this. I mean, when you look at the pre-war 2019, because people should remember when Zelensky was elected, he was elected on a mandate of resolving the war, of resolving the partition of the country, between East and West, of resolving the conflict that was happening on which many people were dying, and finding some way to end it, whether it was some sort of reunification, some sort of federalism, some sort of separation, whatever it is to end the war and the conflict. And when you look at, as I talked about earlier in the show, the negotiations happening in 2019, where Zelensky did agree to negotiate with the People's Republics, as they called themselves, over the issue of this plebiscite that had been discussed and was to some degree part of the Minsk II sort of peace, the people who were opposing him were in fact these far-right forces, the right sector, the Azov Battalion type individuals who were doing everything they possibly could to prevent anything going forward that would allow that sort of agreement, that would allow any sort of vote, that would allow any sort of element that could move beyond this. And so ultimately, we can see that many of the forces that are the most supported by the Western world, as it were, the governments of the Western world, are exactly those who have been the most intransigent around the issue of resolving the conflict. And I think that that in and of itself is an important factor when you see how closely the two things are interlinked. The goals and of the imperialist are not the exact same as the goals of the far right, which are, in their own world and in terms of the region and the country more specifically, but they actually work together and reinforce each other and cannot exist outside of each other. The West would not have the shock troops to push its agenda without these far right, bully, fascistic type forces, and those forces would not be able to move forward without the cover given to them by the sort of broader imperialist world that has done everything possible to prettify them. And of course, and I think we could talk more about this, we can see the role that has been discussed of Boris Johnson, who at that time was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, pushing the Ukrainians not to make any sort of deal. And I think we've seen that throughout the war, that, many, at least the public statements, I'm not privy to the private statements, that many of these Western leaders have, essentially done everything possible to not go in the direction of negotiations, and in fact to try to influence, I think, this is my personal view, influence the internal politics of Ukraine by using these public statements about Ukraine should never have to surrender, we'll back them until they win, we'll back them until all Russian troops are off their territory, which can only stiffen the backbone of the people who would prefer not to negotiate in the broader Ukrainian political space.
Before World War I and before World War II, but especially before World War I, and World War I, which was a war unlike any other war up until that time, a war that took 18 million lives in 4 years, a lot of it happens right there, right in the neighborhood that we're talking about. And there's a lot of big, bad decisions that are made by dynastic rulers. Their assumptions are wrong, their tactical thinking is wrong, their strategic overview is wrong. They make big, bad decisions, and 20 million people die. The reason I'm raising this is I see a similar sequence of really bad decisions. And you think about Biden, for instance. Biden is worried about the rise of Trump or the rise of right-wing political parties in Europe. Well, why are they rising? Why are they rising? It's because the torpedoing of negotiations in Ukraine means the war in Ukraine goes on and on. Well, who's suffering? First and foremost, it's Ukrainians. But it's not just Ukrainians. Europeans are being hit hard in the pocketbook, certainly. A lot of people, just because they know the history of their own country and the history of Europe, they don't want to go down, with serendipity towards another world war, a global conflict. So they think this is madness. So they're going to the left, or they're going especially to the right-wing parties. Well, who created all of this? This, again, I would say, is U.S. imperialism, the Biden administration, the so-called political center, the Social Democrats and Christian Democrats in Germany, Macron in France. In other words, the so-called center, political center, has made this project a priority. And then we go back to these documents that have just been revealed. Well, what were the sticking points? Russia demanded that Ukraine never join NATO or other alliances, that it never host foreign military power bases or weapons, that it never conduct military exercises with other countries without Russia's consent. And what does Ukraine say in response? We agree we'll be permanently a neutral state. This is Zelensky. We will be permanently a neutral state. We will terminate international treaties and agreements that are incompatible with permanent neutrality. Okay, that means Zelensky was ready to move forward, it appears. But then when you look at the sticking points, which the New York Times also reveals, they have to do with the demands of the fascists. There's a demand that Russia be reinstituted as an official language, which again, if 46% of the people in Ukraine are speaking Russian, an official language means that you can function as a normal citizen in Ukraine speaking your language. Well, who wanted to get rid of the language issue? I don't think it was Zelensky, as you said. At that time, Zelensky was a native Russian speaker himself. These are the political pressures of the right wing. The fascists wanted to torpedo this. They didn't want rapprochement. They want an ethnically pure Ukraine, meaning fascism. And who are their allies? The other people who wanted to keep the war going, which was the political center in Washington, in Paris, in Germany. Anyway, that's how I see this.
No, I think it's a good point. And you know, I just, excuse me for a second, you know, also want to note sort of just parenthetically here in terms of how some of these things play and some of the, I'm just looking down here so I can actually get this exactly right when you made the point about the fascist and one of the sticking points about, you know, banning propaganda and organizational ideas and theories around fascism, Nazism, neo-Nazism, and aggressive nationalism. And you think, well, how is it possible you couldn't agree on that? But I think it's an important parenthetical fact here to go back again to the point I'm making about the relationship between the far right and the imperialist in terms of the strategy inside of Central Europe. You know, this is actually a long-running issue, not just in Ukraine, but also in Poland and many other places. And these far-right parties that were like Law and Justice that are ruling Poland and so on and so forth have had and continue to inject into the political discussion in the EU, and, you know, because of the acquiescence of many liberals far before Ukraine, have been able to actually pass, you know, laws like this in the European Parliament to equate Nazism and communism as the exact same thing. And part of the reason why they want to do that is because the political lineage of many of these forces who are the most anti-Russia and in some cases the ruling parties of these countries like Poland is really with the pro-Nazi side during World War II, and the sort of roots of that, those politics in those countries that predate World War II, these sort of far-right, anti-Semitic, fascistic, nationalistic forces that were, you know, at play in this space. But since fascism, of course, is so, you know, terribly rightfully terribly demonized, they have to create this political equivalence with communism so then they can say, okay, well, you're saying 60 years ago, these people were our political lineage. Well, we're saying 60 years ago, these other people were your political lineage, and they're both bad. So you can't say anything about what we're doing today in terms of the far right as, you know, being reminiscent of Nazism or whatever. They're trying to create confusion around the historical memory of World War II, the rise of fascism, the defeat of fascism by the progressive forces, the core of them, of course, being the Soviet Union in Europe, to try to push forward a political agenda today that is extremely far right and heavily anti-Semitic. But ultimately, this is also an extraordinarily pro-Western agenda that, of course, then will be celebrated and brought to the forefront. And that's why many of these Western European social democratic liberals went along with it, because even though these are ridiculous historical allegations, it was actually helping them in terms of the sort of broader political agenda of the broader subset of the continent, as it were. So I just think that's an important factor that we understand in terms of how this thing is playing out in terms of these so-called sticking points, because as you said, it really speaks to how the agenda of the far right is driving so much of why you have been unable to have an agreement in Ukraine, but only with the cover of the imperialists who give them cover because these are their shock troops to push through their agenda. So there really is a long running, certainly in Ukraine and other parts of Central Europe, predating this conflict, political struggle over the historical memory of World War II that's designed to muddy the waters in a way that opened the door in a bigger sense for this extremely pro-imperialist, extremely anti-Russian NATO encirclement campaign that is also being pushed forward by these Central European countries whose entire political lineage is really based on the opposition in these countries during the Soviet era and the Warsaw Pact era, and before that, the oppositions existing in these countries that were more friendly to, you know, the Nazi power and the Nazi vision for what was going to be happening in Europe. So it's serving two roles, but it's serving as the wedge, as it were, to push this geopolitical agenda, which drives the whole thing. Because without it, you know, it would probably collapse under its own weight because of how, you know, ridiculous it is, in fact.
Yeah. I want to go back. I want to actually stay with this topic. I think it's extremely important for people to understand exactly what we're saying, that U.S. imperialism, NATO, which is a tool of U.S. imperialism, is using and manipulating fascist forces for its own geostrategic goals to weaken Russia, to weaken China eventually, et cetera, et cetera. And this has a long history to it. This has a very long history to it. Bandera, the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists, who was the idol of the Azov brigade, battalion, the right sector, the fascist forces that we're talking about in Ukraine, Bandera led a Holocaust against leftists and against Jews and against Poles in Ukraine when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. 7 million Ukrainians died. The Jewish population, which was very significant, very large in Ukraine, was basically exterminated by these people. Now, they, at that time, were fighting on behalf of or with the Germans. I mean, they had some conflicts with the Germans, but basically as an arm of the Nazi invasion. They were anti-communist fascists. And they killed their own people, especially Jewish people in Ukraine. And they're building monuments to Bandera and that team in Ukraine. They're taking down the statues of Lenin. When Ukraine was in the Soviet Union, they were constructed. Now they're being replaced with Bandera. But at the end of World War II, Eugene, the U.S. then, having had Germany as its enemy, decided to basically embrace Germany as a new ally against the Soviet Union and against the left and against communists in Europe who were ascendant at that time. And even though there was the Nuremberg trials and a few of the Nazis were executed, a great number of them were immediately given new identities, passports, U.S. citizenship, and integrated into the U.S. military. Like Werner von Braun, the head of NASA, the man on the moon project, led by a Nazi. The leadership of NATO, during the next 20 years, many former high chief of staff of Hitler's military high command became the NATO chief. I mean, again, the U.S. is including the so-called liberals or the center political forces, not the far right, not the Proud Boys, not the Three Percenters, but the Democratic Party, perfectly willing to work with fascists in the sort of aim of securing American geostrategic goals. They don't really care that they're fascists as long as they're working with the United States. And so there's this kind of symbiotic relationship between the Ukrainian fascists and American imperialism. And ultimately, the war that the U.S. pushes and promotes and demands continue then gives rise to right-wing forces in Western Europe that eventually may turn against the United States because the masses of people in Europe don't want the war. And for the right-wingers in Europe, the right-wing political parties, even to demagogically win the support of parts of the working class and the poor and the middle class, they'll say, look, that's an American war. Europe should be European. We shouldn't be following the tail. We shouldn't be the tail to America. Again, this is the dialectical element of what's going on in geostrategic politics. But the bottom line, and this is why I want to keep repeating it for people, when you look at what's happening in Europe, including the rise of the right, or what's happening in the United States, blame the Democratic Party establishment, blame the center political forces in imperialism because they're pursuing their own agenda, which then ultimately blows back against them. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very well taken point. I mean, for the United States, and as I mentioned before, they have to control Europe at the end of the day, because for the United States to be the sole hegemon, they can't have the other developed countries have their own, agenda. But the natural sort of development sort of path for those countries is to work very closely with Russia, these Western European countries, in which they do economically, prior to this, did work very closely with Russia. And there are many who wanted to work even more closely. But of course, that combination then starts to upset the apple cart of having the United States be the creator of the rules-based international order. And the point you're making about post-World War II is 100% correct. I mean, the U.S. spent an inordinate amount of money, and I think the payoff is coming now, by the way, in the Ukraine war, in shaping the politics of Western Europe, creating both on the right and the left, these sort of captured entities that would become the political elites of the rebuilt Europe. And I think now you're seeing in the context of Ukraine, where all these European leaders are just cutting their own throats economically in order to back this U.S. agenda. I mean, the U.S. making plenty of money in terms of selling gas now to Europe. Europe is now destroying its own industries on behalf of this. You can see that this long long attempt to create this sort of captured, tamed European ruling class that was at all cost, including sacrificing its own people, going to be tied to this Atlanticist vision of the world, was absolutely critical for the United States to carry out its attempt to control Europe, to prevent a hegemon from emerging. Now, for most of the 20th century, that did not work because the Soviet Union existed as a counterweight. But as the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, then it was able to come into its own in a real way. And again, as we keep saying, of course, the U.S. was able to mobilize the anti-Russian political forces in Central Europe, some parts of it we consider Eastern Europe, but sort of Central and Eastern Europe, in order to push this agenda. So that symbiotic relationship has been there, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and it's all behind this key geostrategic goal, which is to make sure, again, to get between Germany and Russia, to prevent a European state that could challenge America emerging, and to make sure that the military power of Russia is essentially declawed because they're surrounded by NATO and all these various little countries, and that ultimately, as it was said in one of the early national defense strategies of the early 1990s, the goal is really to push Russia to be essentially a neutered, demilitarized country so that it cannot play any sort of significant role on the world stage. Russia, of course, has resisted that, and that's why we are today, really, quite frankly.
All right. I want to talk about one other, I think, extremely important element in this story. So we've covered the fact that the U.S. actually toppled Yanukovych, a corrupt but democratically elected government that wanted to be neutral. The U.S., I think, with the fascists, torpedoed the negotiations that would have ended the war 2 years ago, 2 years and 2 months ago, which would have saved the lives of 500,000 people, or people who have either been killed or horribly wounded. The U.S. just wants war, more war. It's very good for American business, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another element, which is Ukraine is a big country. Ukraine was the second biggest republic in the USSR. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the USSR. Ukraine might have gotten its oil and petroleum products from the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan in the Caspian Sea. It might have gotten its cotton from Kazakhstan, but it gave those other republics wheat and other grains because it's a very significant agricultural country. Mm-hmm. It has a lot else going for it because it became, especially in the Donbass, a heavily industrialized area during the 1930s. But now it's an impoverished country. The people in Ukraine, maybe the middle class is doing fine. The workers, the peasants, the smaller farmers, they're not doing fine at all. And here's an article, the headline, Eugene, from the New York Times. To pay for the war, Ukraine embraces privatization. And then the first line, the government hopes to sell off a range of companies to fund the military and stabilize the economy as the grueling conflict with Russia drains its coffers. Again, think about this, everybody. This war could have ended 2 years and 2 months ago. They were near to an agreement. The U.S. and NATO didn't want an agreement. So now Ukraine is additionally poor because they have to fund the economy, meaning also fund the arms that are coming from other places. It's a grueling conflict. It's almost like it's inevitable now that Ukraine must do something to pay its bills under a capitalist Ukrainian government. So how will it pay for the war bill? It will embrace privatization. This is the New York Times BS kind of weird, not weird, but carefully crafted language in bourgeois journalism to hide the underlying reality that Ukraine has become an economic colony of Wall Street and of Paris and of London and of Germany. Anyway, I know you've done a lot of research on this.
Yeah, well, this has been the plan all along, going back to the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement in 2013, 2014, that sort of started this whole thing off, or at least the struggle about it. And it's not inconsistent with what the EU has done as it's expanded into other, former Warsaw Pact nations in sort of Central and Eastern Europe, which is to push an extreme market agenda that ultimately results in sort of a smash and grab raid on the economies of these countries by Western capital from the United States and from Western Europe in order to really make a bonanza. And then also by integrating them into the freedom of movement issues as it concerns the EU. It also allows you to do a brain drain of the people who actually live in these countries, who then move into more affluent Western Europe and work for very low wages on a number of different fronts. So this was what was happening in Ukraine. But, the immediate aftermath of what took place in the Maidan, you have this exact issue. And you have almost, the way to look at it is from sort of 2014 to now, part of the increasing support for the West, by the West for the Ukrainian government is predicated on deepening this project of opening up the country to being looted by major Western economic interest. And it started from the very beginning, and it often operates from a blackmail type perspective, because as you pointed, Ukraine is poor. In 2019, it's the poorest country in Europe. In 2019, 41% of people were living in poverty. There's a lot of needs that are there. And so the IMF and the World Bank, the European Union and others sort of hold this bailout money that they over the head of Ukraine as like a sword of Damocles, because they don't have a lot of money, and say, well, we'll give you this money, but each time you want the money, you have to do more and more to make sure the countries, the companies from the countries in Western Europe and America can come in and take over, do whatever they want, and exploit workers in a major way. I mean, even in 2014, right away, to get about a $17 billion bailout from the IMF and about $3.5 billion from the World Bank. They said that the Ukrainian government was going to have to slash pensions, cut wages, start selling off companies, so on and so forth, privatize banks. So even in 2014, the agenda was set. But it took some time for this to really play out for a lot of different reasons that I think are, not necessarily germane right now. But it really in 2018 starts to push forward in a major, major way. Because in 2017, this issue of getting more money from the IMF towards the end of the year becomes a bigger thing. So in 2018, Ukraine passes a law that was a law they were required to pass in order to be able to get this money from the IMF that they wanted to unlock in this deal, where that they would be willing to privatize over 3,000 companies that were owned by the government, and that they would move towards the creation of what's called an agricultural land market, but basically letting foreign companies come in and buy land. And I'll come back and talk about that, but that they had to open up agriculture to big agribusiness coming from the US in a big way, and also Western Europe, and that they would have to privatize 3,000 companies at least, and that these would be key companies. Some of them are small companies and whatever, things that are owned by the government in Ukraine, but the banking sector would have to be totally privatized as one of the issues. Major corporations in titanium and other sort of big industries, those would have to be privatized and pushed out, and that this was going to be the agenda. And that's March of 2018 that they passed this law at the behest of the IMF to secure this loan to get this money to fund the government operations. Worth noting, at that time, there was a survey done by the pro-privatization people, by the way, in early 2018, in January of 2018, that 49% of the country opposed the privatization of these SOEs, these state-owned enterprises. But nonetheless, the parliament went forward at the behest of the IMF and opened things up in a major way. And that same month, March of 2018, the Atlantic Council, which is the think tank for NATO, had an article that said Ukraine is serious about privatization this time. And the whole article is saying, now we finally done it. We put them into a corner. We're going to be able to have this smash and grab raid and take over their economy. And then it goes on and on, moving from that point moving forward. In July of 2022, there was a Ukraine recovery conference. Ursula von der Leyen was there. It was a big thing about how we're going to rebuild Ukraine after the war. Liz Truss, who was the British Prime Minister, was there at the time. But the way that they were going to rebuild Ukraine was an even further deepening of these different reforms, including privatizing even more enterprises, including non-critical enterprises, finalizing the corporatization of SOEs, which basically means handing them over to private consultants like McKinsey to run, privatizing all the rest of the state-owned banks, so that's a total free market piece, and then also urging them to cut taxes on corporations and wealthy capitalists, and to slash labor protections. And what's important about that, I'm talking about July 2022. In August 2022, They approve a law signed by Zelensky doing just that, removing rights for workers, and over 70% of Ukrainian workers were stripped of many of their most important labor protections. Collective bargaining agreements were totally destroyed. Things around salaries and holidays, that's off the board. Trade unions at that point could actually challenge dismissals as being against the law. They get rid of that. So that's 1 month after this Western-backed conference saying slash your labor laws. Ukraine is slashing their labor laws. Open up and sell your companies. They're doing even more of that. September of that year, Zelensky comes, goes to the New York Stock Exchange, says we want to bring $400 billion into the country. We've got 55 projects. So there's a direct relationship, as you can see here, between these Western-backed pushes and the imposition on Ukraine of this deep privatization that, again, was opposed by many people. And in one of the areas where it's become the most notable has been agriculture. You know, the top 5 agricultural firms in Ukraine, 2 of them are now U.S. companies. And the top firm in Ukraine is technically a Ukrainian company, but 58% of the company is owned by foreign investors. 8 of the top 10 of those investors are from the US or the European Union. And the other 2 that are not from there are from the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, which means that they're probably from the US and the European Union, just through various pass-throughs, as you can see. So, you know, the overall issue, and that law, by the way, that opened this up, that was passed in 2020, I want to say, March of 2020, 64% of Ukrainians opposed opening up the land like this, but they did it anyway. So you can see that the impact of this, and moving on with the war and the point you made about the New York Times, which came out relatively recently in 2024, from 2014 to 2024, the predicate for being closer integrated into the European Union and into the West was that they allow Western companies to lead a smash and grab raid on the most valuable assets of Ukraine and turn them into valuable assets for Western corporations. So that's Western freedom that is being offered to Ukraine, is make sure your economy is completely controlled by Europe, by the United States, that is going to put into place, not only taking the profits, but put into place big plantation agriculture that drives people, off of the land, that they're going to get rid of all the labor laws, which means that more people are going to be leaving Ukraine because they're going to be getting fired. They're going to be downsizing, right-sizing, bringing in technology. People are getting paid so low, they're not going to be able to survive. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to Western Europe. They're going to become low-wage workers in those economies. So it's the complete and total economic colonization and exploitation of Ukraine presented as some form of freedom that was the prerequisite, the predicate for them to be allowed into the Western club. If they wouldn't have done any of this, they would not have been able to get the military support. They would not have been able to get the political support that they've gotten. And it only gets deeper and deeper day by day. Also, you mentioned the New York Times article. I don't know if this was mentioned in there or not. I can't remember the article. But recently here in 2024, a central bank president of Ukraine was in a conference in Western Europe and stated, we're going to move forward. We're going to try to privatize this year, or hopefully soon after this year, 3 of the top 10 banks in the country that are not privatized. So we're moving forward on that front to quote unquote reassure investors. So, I mean, it's an amazing issue to really see. It's totally undercut, but let's just summarize it again. They have passed laws that have made it so that all of the most important and many non-important businesses that are state-owned can be bought by foreign companies, almost certainly Western companies. They've opened up the land in a way that has been totally dominated now by Western multinationals and big agribusiness. They are cutting pensions, cutting wages. They are eliminating labor protections for 70% of workers inside of Ukraine. And they're doing all of this over the opposition of the people, 50% who didn't want to privatize any SOEs and the 64% who didn't want to privatize the land. That doesn't matter whatsoever. It's the quid pro quo between the pro-Western Ukrainian elites and the imperialist forces that are backing them, that if you want to be in our club, you have to destroy your economy and you have to turn it into an economic colony of the West, and you have to parenthetically then agree to the brain drain of your own people to be sent to be low-wage workers in our countries.
Lenin said that the most important freedom in a bourgeois democracy is the freedom to exploit labor. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, and in spite of the determination, the will, the feelings, the sentiments of the working class, none of that matters, because under a capitalist government, whether it was leaning towards Russia or leaning towards the West, basically the masses of people are being viewed as a source of profit, as a source of exploitation, including the countryside. And I thought it was so important what you said, Eugene, that the masses of people didn't want this. They didn't want to privatize. They didn't want to have the state-owned enterprises privatized. They don't want, obviously, to give up regulations that protect workers on the job. They don't want to be in a state of endless economic insecurity or poverty. And it made me think when you were talking about the referendum that was organized by the capitalist counter-revolutionaries who toppled the Soviet Union in December 1991, including Boris Yeltsin, who had taken over the government in Russia and made the Communist Party of the Soviet Union or the Communist Party of Russia illegal, just as the Communist Party in Ukraine now is illegal. They broke up the Soviet Union, but in March of 1991, March 17th, 1991, they organized a referendum so that all the different republics, and there were 15 of them, again, Ukraine was the second biggest after Russia, they got to vote on one simple question. Do you support the maintenance of the Soviet Union, or should it be dissolved? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but in essence, that was the one question. And the capitalist counter-revolutionaries thought they would have this big vote for breaking up the Soviet Union, especially by people in the non-Russian republics. And then they could say, see, we listened to a democratic mandate of the people. They no longer want communism. They no longer want socialism. They no longer want the USSR. So we have to listen to them. And to their shock, 70% of the people in the Soviet Union voted no. They don't want to dissolve the Soviet Union. They want to maintain it. That was March 1991. In Ukraine and in other places where collective farms were the center of agriculture, those collective farmers did not want to break up the Soviet Union. They did not want to break up the collective farms. In a collective farm, whether it rained or whether the sun was shining, you knew you were going to be taken care of. Your fate wasn't left to nature, or whether the market would collapse or not under a capitalist system. And in spite of all of that democratic aspirations and yearning showing that people want to retain the existing system, I'm sure they wanted to make reforms in it, but they wanted to retain it. They broke it up anyway. The capitalist counter-revolutionaries didn't care at all about the people, and when the people said, we don't want this, they just ignored them. That's the history, Eugene, in Ukraine, all the way since 1991.
Yeah.
The masses of people, what they want doesn't matter. And I think it's so important for people, and I've been asked this, well, don't you show that you're not caring about Ukrainians when you say that the war in Ukraine should come to an end, that the U.S. should cut funds for more military equipment to Ukraine? Doesn't that mean you're turning your back on the Ukrainian people? And I think the only answer really is the war itself is an indication that the people, the plight of the people, the needs of the people, the well-being of the people has been completely neglected. It's not the masses of people in Ukraine who want endless war with Russia, a country that we're at peace with ever since the creation of the USSR in 1922. They don't want that. This is Western and capitalist forces in Ukraine, in Western Europe, and on Wall Street, and of course the military-industrial complex. If you care about Ukrainians, you should want this war to end. And the only way to end is to have a negotiated settlement. And we can see from these documents that both sides were seemingly ready to do it 2 years ago. And obviously the fascists and American imperialism, the Biden administration said no. Anyway, I'm going to give you the final word.
No, I think that's right. And I'll just say quickly here, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Kananovich brothers from the Ukrainian Communist Party who have been arrested and essentially disappeared at this point, for a number of reasons. But one of the things those two brothers are most known for was leading protests against the privatization of land, against the privatization of state-owned enterprises that were significant. You look at 2019, 2020, a lot of farmers and others who were demonstrating. So there was a lot of resistance inside of Ukraine to these sorts of policies. There was a rising tide of feeling that that they should try to find a way to heal the rifts. That's why Zelensky was elected. And I think we can't allow that to be sort of memory hold, even though, of course, a lot has changed in the context of the war. But I think you're entirely correct that it can be ended. It can be ended right away. And it can be ended right away by addressing the core root cause issues. I mean, this is often referred to as, sort of quote unquote Russian security concerns, of which there are quote unquote Russian security concerns. But I think it's important to recognize inside of Ukraine that the issue of the settlement speaks to the deep divisions that have been in the country, for many, many years, but have been, main points of contention since the first election in 1994 up until 2014 over what kind of country it should be and over how the different contested sort of social, cultural, political, and historical elements, as well as economic, when we talk about policies, should be played out. The whole reason Zelensky in 2019 was willing to acquiesce to a vote inside of Donetsk and Luhansk and other places, and also to, allow Crimea to remain the same, is because there is a cultural, historical, political, economic aspect to that it was highly unlikely that people in that area, after what had taken place, that the imposition of this government that had come in 2014 was saying, you can't have your language recognized in any serious way, and that we're willing to fight and murder anybody who has a totally different view, that these people likely would not want to come back into a Ukraine like that. And if you gave them a vote, they would probably vote for some sort of either deep federalism, autonomy, or some form of relationship with Russia. So this whole idea that the Russian troops have to be removed or whatever, and the votes that took place there have to be reversed, actually has no real relationship to the developing political dynamics since 2014 that exist in deeply rooted facets of the country. And if we abandon that complete fiction that is pushed by these Western governments, that can't be recognized, that the actual differences in Ukraine can't be recognized, we would get even closer. The same thing can be said about the issues of historical memory and language in terms of the laws that are there inside of Ukraine, in terms of what they would have to agree to, in terms of banning different Nazi propaganda, again, speaks to these core issues for Ukrainians, not just the issue of where Russia is at, but of course, Russia also is relevant to this question and somewhat a party to this discussion because of many of these sort of both divergent and shared issues on a historical, political, social, economic, and cultural level that also have to be considered, including, of course, the history of invasions from Napoleon, from Hitler, and, exactly through these areas and the context of what the NATO imposition further and further east has sparked amongst Russian people themselves, who lost 27 million, or the Soviet Union lost 27 million. They lost many tens of millions in World War II, who also have different concerns. So if we take seriously the history of Ukraine, the divisions inside of Ukraine, the history of Central and Eastern Europe, the history of the Soviet Union and its dissolution, the history of Russia and its relationship to Western Europe and different anti-Russian movements, we can resolve this conflict right away. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will be 100% happy with how it's resolved, but we have to have this thing that is rooted in realism. And right now, the whole political debate is not rooted in realism. Or at least put it to you like this. The debate as we're given in the United States is not rooted in realism. It's based on a fake historical narrative that does not actually take into account any of these complex issues and is opposed to an incredibly simplistic, one-sided view pushed by one narrow set of interest in Ukraine and adopted by the imperialists to push forward their sort of broader agenda of, again, controlling Europe to prevent the emergence of a new hegemon that could potentially challenge the United States on the world stage. You don't have to believe me. Read every single national defense strategy since 1992, and you will see that is exactly what they're trying to do. It is 100% the plan that they've put forward. It's extraordinarily dangerous, and it's led us to a space where even the idea of nuclear war is being discussed. So let's start from the real issues in Ukraine and work outwards, and we can certainly resolve this. That's why they were so close to making an agreement, because both sides know the issues very well. They are their issues, and it was broken apart by those who want a war because it will push forward their agenda in Ukraine, and those who want a war because it'll push forward their agenda geopolitically.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Eugene Puryear, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.